Hello and welcome to Building Context. This is a video series that we're doing on APIs and API security. And today I'm joined again by Mike Litsvitsky. He's our technical evangelist here at Salt Security. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, Chris. It's good to be here again.
It's great to have you back. And today we have actually a short series that we're going to do. We're going to dig into the topic of API attacks and different types of attacks. We're going to try and put some sort of definition around these. I know, we were talking earlier about how the definition is, in some cases, a little nebulous and can kind of bleed over into some of these other types of attacks. But we'll do our best to put some boundaries around this. And really, the goal is to help folks better understand the types of attacks, what attackers are after, and how you can protect yourself. So we're going to start off this first episode by talking about scraping. And scraping has multiple different connotations as we talked about. So let's start off by just putting a definition around scraping. What do we mean when we say scraping?
Yeah, let's try to arrive at some base level. And it's interesting, right? Because scraping, certainly to like financial industry, their heads might go towards something like screen scraping, which it's kind of more traditional, right? Like I'm going to scan the screen and pull out data. In the world of APIs, when we talk about scraping, we've talked about this extensively. APIs are typically the pathways to your data. That's how you expose things to customers, partners. That's the vehicle to data. So attackers unfortunately know this, right? They target APIs, they find them by reverse engineering apps. And they, if that data is of value, they're going to attempt to scrape it. Really all that means is usually it's done with some level of automation, right? Because like once I figured out, well, I can get this piece of data, I want to kind of piece that together and get larger data sets because now maybe I can resell that or use that for some other malicious purpose. So usually there's an end goal of like kind of piecing together the data to use more maliciously. So I want to automate in some way. Typically, there's an API that it has to be public, internet facing. You're exposing some pieces of data, and then the attacker's going to extract that data out. We also see where this is kind of linked with excessive data exposure, right? Because typically, as organizations build APIs, they might give more information than what is necessary for API clients like the web front end or the mobile app. So they'll serve up a lot of data and then expect the front end to filter that out. Unfortunately, that's excessive data exposure, right? Because we've talked about attackers will target the APIs like to scrape them. If they see it's giving a lot of metadata about a given user or documents, you name it, that's ripe for the plunder, right? So like that. Yeah. That's scraping, right? I'm going to find this API that serves up data. Typically it's exposing more than it should, and then I'd say the authentication and authorization mechanism might be a little more lax, right? Because you're typically trying to serve some business purpose, like whether it's consumers or just a purely public API. Those in turn become big targets for scraping.
Got it. Any examples of scraping recently that you can think of just to put people's mind in the
I mean the one we've documented that's unfortunately aging is the Parler incident. Because kind of going back to what I was saying about scraping, it's like typically there's that end goal of like I want a lot of data and I want to do this on a massive scale. In that Parler incident, every piece of data in the platform, that social media platform, was scraped. Photos, message posts, everything. Right? It was many gigabytes. Actually, forgot the total. Terabytes of data, everything. Right? What often happens with scraping attacks, when we hear about them in the news, they're more so incidents where you find a security researcher might stumble upon the API by reverse engineering a mobile app, just like the attacker, and then they're going to go public with it, right? And they'll usually advise the owning party, like, look, your authorization model's weak. You should kind of make that more robust. You're exposing too much data, and it's caught, right? So it's like we don't have these millions of records lost. It's like you have this API, it's exposing too much data. I can automate my requests against it and now pull out all of your data or
Right.
what could be considered private, and it could become kind of the nightmare scenario. So it's a lot more cases like that. We saw that pretty recently with Peloton, for instance,
Right.
right? Like the
That's a
API
classic
was
one.
just exercise class information, and Peloton was probably like, this is for people in the class, like, and they're using their bikes. Who would care about this? But that's the reality with attackers. They're going to reverse engineer your code, whatever it
Yeah.
may be in the Peloton example, it's in the bikes, right, or the mobile apps, and kind of use that information for malicious purpose. Maybe it's to social engineer Peloton users. Maybe they can use that information in other social engineering attacks, credential stuffing attacks. So data is of value. That's kind of the world we live in, right? That drives a lot of data security initiatives.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So
those are the two, I'd say, kind of most recent impactful examples.
I think those are both good examples of customer information or personal information, right? And that's obviously a big attack or a big target for a lot of these attacks. But I think the other category, if you think about retailers, is product information or
Yep.
inventory information. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and what people are after and
Yeah.
how they automate that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up, Chris, because it's kind of where you see some split on types of scraping. Like we've talked about harvesting kind of private information for some uh, businesses in particular, depending on their vertical. They're going to build an API. In the case of an e-commerce site, it's going to have very specific product information. They spend a lot of time building up product catalogs. Maybe it has images, information about products.
Yeah.
If I am a competitor to that e-commerce company, I might want to scrape that, right? It saves me the effort of having to do it.
Yeah.
So that's one example, and that's kind of more squarely content scraping. Um, there's also price scraping, which can also happen in e-commerce, right? Because if I can pull that same API that's telling me what product is available, it's also going to tell me what the price is, right?
Yeah.
And if I'm a competitor, I can undercut on price, and I can do that much more real time than trying to manually scan sites, scan manually where I'm just clicking through products and all right, this one's $20. Let's offer it for 15. Now I can automate all that, right,
Right.
with via API calls and extracting that data because those APIs are open because you want to serve your customers. So they're very specific kind of abuse cases of APIs, like the API is working exactly as intended. It's just now you're dealing with less legitimate usage of them.
Yeah.
And as businesses, right, you run into this where you have competitors trying to undercut you. The other example that usually pops up is kind of the hospitality industry. So
Yeah,
if
hotels,
I'm selling hotels, yeah, or
airlines.
airfare, yep,
Yeah. Concert tickets, anything
yep,
that I guess is price sensitive and you're after a finite thing.
yep.
Um, so, what are some of the techniques that attackers are using when they're going after these scraping vulnerabilities or they're performing these scraping types of
Yeah.
attacks?
Um, like most things, it starts with reconnaissance, right? So I might consider what's a uh, somebody selling widgets. Like let's just go very generic as
Yeah.
an example. So
About shoes?
widget.com, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe I don't like widget.com. And I like cards.com, right? So I want to pull down all the information from widget.com. I'm going to find the APIs that they're exposing
Yeah.
to facilitate their business. Typically that would start with, well, what's the web browser experience? So, browse over to widgets.com, pick apart, the HTML and JavaScript that's executing in the web browser that's interacting with backend APIs, because that you're going to see those connections to fill out product catalog and pay in your page view.
Yeah.
The other technique is usually in mobile apps, kind of pick apart iOS or Android mobile code, see those same API calls in code. The other prominent technique is to hook in intercepting proxy tool like Portswigger Burp Suite or OWASP Attack Proxy, and those really just expose the web communications, right? And now as an attacker, I can see exactly how to invoke those APIs You're going to see if too much data is exposed, right? That
Yeah.
excessive data exposure scenario we're talking about. But typically, I want to look for APIs that I can hit very maybe rapidly, but in higher numbers, I might still want to throttle that connection. But it needs to be serving up pieces of data. It could be an authenticated call. It's not necessarily a deal breaker. It's just
Yeah.
like are there rate limits imposed on that authenticated session, how many times it can hit an API? But yeah, it's kind of what's the data that's being served by that API, and then can I script around it, right? And then those things like authentication around it and rate limits would kind of make something a little raise the bar a little bit for the attacker. Like it's harder to scrape this, but not impossible. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these sites, even if they require an account, for a mobile app or even for a web app, a lot of them are public sites. It's quite easy to get a legitimate account, and then
yep.
you have access to the API, and you're using something like Burp Suite to kind of reverse engineer the API.
Yep.
So that that's if we can get into a little bit of the techniques from a defender perspective, authentication obviously, although it's not 100% effective, it's definitely a requirement if it makes sense.
Yep.
In certain applications, rate limiting you mentioned, but I think attackers are they're pretty in tune to that kind of stuff, and they look for ways
Yeah.
to those limits. What are some other methods that can be used beyond sort of the basics?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? So we talk about this in a lot of our content where traditional approaches often don't scale, right?
Yeah,
Because rate limits, if you're dealing with millions of users and it is publicly accessible information, how do you know what's not normal, right?
right.
Like it's by design served to designed to serve up that much content. The reality is it becomes like a data analytics problem. You have to be tracking how are my um, API callers invoking the API and consuming that content. So it's much about analyzing traffic patterns. What are the behaviors against that API, right? So now you can
Yeah,
start to spot malicious activity. Even in cases where somebody is throttling connections down to evade rate limits or cycling through IP addresses to disperse their scraping attacks. You could still spot that type of activity because it's not a normal pattern, right? Where you have somebody invoking this API and kind of extracting information. You can extract that signal, but you have to analyze a lot of telemetry, right? Which is your API traffic.
well, and I think it's hard. You just take the example of retail. Retail is very seasonal, and you could put out a product that's quite popular. Maybe somebody tweets about it or blogs about it, and all of a sudden you see a big unpredictable spike in traffic.
Yep.
And as a business owner, you make a decision as to whether or not you want to, block that traffic, which could be legitimate, or if you want to rate limit and
Mm-hmm.
take the risk. So I think that goes to your point. I think that there are, if you think about the early stages of an attack, you said that the attacker needs to start to map out the API, and I think in doing so, there's potentially a lot of very very subtle
Mm-hmm.
anomalies that are generated, right? That aren't necessarily attacks. They're not hitting rate limits. They're not something that's predictable, but it's just how does the attacker understand what they're up against and what they're trying to
Yep.
manipulate? I think that's where you can look for anomalies that are very subtle and put protections in place to stop
Yeah.
attackers in those early stages.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Chris. Yeah, because even in those automation tools, you can craft requests to hit backends, but that header information might not look exactly like your normal mobile app, right? Unless the attacker has really thought 20 steps ahead to mimic the traffic exactly. Yeah, there's likely going to be some giveaway. So you can catch it more proactively in those reconnaissance stages. But yeah, on the tail end and runtime, you are dealing with mountains of data to extract. Like, is
Yeah,
this anomalous? Like, to your point, like a seasonal product launch or seasonal demand or new product launches, it's tricky, right? And typically we see organizations relax rate limits in those scenarios because they know they're going to have huge traffic spikes. So
yeah,
those
but they're
typical or mechanisms just don't work.
they're guessing a lot of times. So I think that's a great case for AI and ML, and analyzing a bunch of data, looking for
Yep.
those needles in a haystack and trying to catch and identify and stop those attackers early in their process.
Yep.
Well,
Absolutely.
Michael, thanks for this overview. I'd love to hear from folks that are watching this what they think about our definition of scraping, and if there are other things that we should be considering. But I look forward to having you on again. We're going to dig into a couple of different attack types, and it should be a lot of fun.
Yep.
Thanks for coming
Absolutely.
by.
Good stuff. Thanks, Chris.